The White Australia policy was brought in almost immediately after Australian Federation in 1901. It was a reactionary policy to the influx of Chinese migrants that came due to the gold rush in the 1850s and onwards. The Australian government used propaganda to portray the Chinese as immoral and suggest that they would corrupt Australian society. The policy had a significant impact on both sides of my family's migration to Australia, but in very different ways. In the 1950s, my grandfather and grandmother brought their 3 children over from China to live in Australia, looking for a new home and life. The White Australia policy during this time deeply reflected the attitudes of Australian society, and my family often experienced severe racism. My 2 uncles, who were school age, remember open and accepted racism as part of their day-to-day schooling. The whole family were required to reapply to stay in Australia every 2 years. Dictation tests were commonly used as a way of disallowing entry to non-white immigrants. Here you can see my grandfather was lucky enough to receive an exemption the year before dictation tests were removed. My mother had a very different experience in Australia to her older siblings, being born 20 years later in 1963. By then, the Australian government was beginning to be less strict with their White Australia policy, and by the time my mum was in school, many Australians were aiming to be a multicultural society. When asked about her schooling, she recalls little racism aimed at her. Fortunately for mum and her younger siblings, they experienced little to no impact of the slowly disappearing White Australia policy compared to that of their parents and older siblings. Let's now move for a moment to the other side of the world, where the impact of the White Australia policy differs completely to that on the Chinese in Australia. After World War II, Australia sought to increase Australia's population for protection against the Japanese, and decided to target the United Kingdom. Australia was advertised in England as a land of promises and opportunity, and Britons could travel to Australia for only £10. These migrants were known to Australia as £10 Poms. Dad was one of hundreds of thousands of £10 Poms that arrived in Australia by simply the luck of being white. He left Liverpool, England when he was 17 in 1977 and arrived in Sydney, Australia. It was the first plane trip he had ever taken. Here, he happily found a job, earned money, and travelled Australia. He was living the easy life that the government had promised him. These 2 migrant stories that were so significantly yet differently impacted by the White Australia policy meet with my mum and dad. I was born in 1992 and grew up in what I remember to be a fairly multicultural society. The knowledge of my family's history is important to me, particularly as a teacher. It reminds me that government policies are not faraway ideas that do not affect us, but can have significant impacts on families and children. These policies are then reflected in education, as seen by my school experiences compared to my auntie and uncles.
I crouch like a crow, contrast in the snow.